first I'll introduce myself just a bit. If you haven't seen me before or know my story, just for the sake of spending a minute getting to know each other, my background, as was mentioned, has really been involved in DevOps from the beginning, and in some sense even before that. So, back in the beginning of my career, I was quote unquote software developer working in agile projects. And then at some point I was involved in a project called Puppet, which is where I got into the infrastructure automation. And then really the last 10 years especially has been focused on open source infrastructure automation, and then bringing people together to use these tools. So, OpenStack, Cloud Foundry, Kubernetes, also some Spring and Kafka and the rest of those fun toys, but getting people together to work on building things in a better way and delivering them. And then it's kind of funny because in the bios it says Maddie works at Red Hat. I came to Red Hat before he did, and then it says I'm the global part of the global organizing team for DevOps Days, and that is, both of those are true. But I think Maddie does way more for DevOps Days lately than I have been, and so he should definitely get credit for that. So as I said, I work at Red Hat. If you want to get a hold of me or have conversations about any of these things, reach out to me on LinkedIn, on my name, or Little Idea on Twitter. This is where I live. So this is actually not quite my backyard, but it kind of looks like that. That cactus is right outside my house. It's about, I don't know, 10 meters tall. So I said this before, but I really believe it, and I'm going to keep saying it over and over until everyone else believes it too. The most important thing for you to do in your DevOps journey, as individuals or an organization, and hopefully this will be reiterated in other ways by the end, is to learn how to communicate. And so with that in mind, it's very important that we can read, that we can write, and that we can speak. And then also, just to be funny and silly, you should make sure that you tweet this talk on Twitter. So this is this core issue that I think is interesting to solve, because I think DevOps is actually at its core very simple, but it's difficult because no one can just do it by themselves, right? So from the very beginning and the way the word is created, you have this notion of at least two different entities. There's many more, and we know in reality when we get to work that it's even more. But developers and operators are recognized as sort of two different groups, and in order for them to kind of accomplish these things that they want to accomplish together, there's no way one group can do it alone. And really today is an exploration of how those two groups are one, in some sense, set up to be against each other, and then two, hopefully some kind of new language and new tools to think about how they can work together, or patterns of success working together. So this is actually a review. So this were on slides I put in last time, and this is a framing around software. So people will say software is eating the world, or some version of digital transformation implies that. I believe this is what we're actually watching, we're experiencing, and given the fact that I'm talking to you across an ocean in essentially real time, it is part of this. So there's a computer in our pockets most of the time that is connected to the high-speed data that we all create. The sum of all human knowledge is available to us, and we individually interact with all of these digital experiences constantly. In some cases, maybe we do that too much. But what I feel is happening, and before it's just accelerated, is that all these things that humans do are being optimized with software, right? And that's our opportunity as well. That's a challenge and an opportunity. So every aspect of human performance experience that can be optimized will be. And then to me, DevOps, again, this is a review from what I put on slides last year. DevOps is really about optimizing the human performance and experience operating software with software. So we're using software, better tools to improve the software that we do deliver, right? But also with humans. So we're optimizing human performance and experience operating software with software and with humans. And then just to make this point clear, I'm going to make that text much bigger. Humans and humans. You might know some. So DevOps is people. DevOps is people. I think there's a real tendency to focus on the tools, and that's okay. The tools are great and very fun to play with, but also they're not the hard part, and they're not the end goal. So DevOps is people, and they're working together. So it's not just that there are people. The magic happens when you get Dev and Ops to work together. That's the beginning and the end of the DevOps story, is people working together. So the DevOps dilemma is that we all have selfish interests. So there's some specific selfish interests that we'll go into, but you have interests, I have interests, everyone in your place of work has interests. Those aren't always the same. And in particular, we have this divide in the interests between developers and operations. And this is, again, this is a review. I believe I had a version of these slides last time. I know I did. So just to review, and I'm sure you've seen some of this in your own career, you have developers and you have operators, and then the traditional model for doing this is largely putting a wall of confusion between them. And this wall is actually really about the rules that everyone kind of has to play by, and the game that they're trying to win. And I'll talk a bit more about that. But in a lot of traditional process, there's this tendency for this wall to really be only crossed with tickets. So we don't even interact with each other as human beings, but only through email and ticket systems. We send these things, and then someone who doesn't have our context, doesn't understand our game and our selfish interests, is trying to optimize for their selfish interests. And that leads to people being unhappy, or maybe even worse. Maybe even worse. So I don't know if this is like where you work, but I've certainly seen this pattern before. So this is, like I said before, two different games, and each side is basically trying to win their game. They have a selfish understanding of the world. Their local optimization is to try to win the game that they're playing. So let's talk a bit about those games and the game we're trying to play on both sides of that wall. And I've played both these games before. So on one side, we have the developers who are trying to accelerate differentiation and create value. And on the other side, you have the operators who are trying to create this model of excellence and efficiency, reducing variation versus creating variation. So just to make it even more simple, one side's, and this is the oversimplification, but one side's really trying to create more value, while the other one's trying to drive down costs. And then you see this playing out in a lot of organizations across the planet, that you essentially have set up a bit of a core conflict between the business units and the software developers and the central IT and the kind of operators. And on one side, we're trying to get more customers, we're trying to do things differently. On the other side, we're trying to control costs and use these best practice to do the same thing repeatedly. So this is I see this over and over in almost every organization I talk to. Oops. So this is, again, I believe that these sort of rules and the way that this is divided and in some cases institutionalized, sort of sets these groups against each other, kind of forces us to be against each other. So what can we do to get out of that? The wall of confusion is really about not understanding the other game that's on the other side of the wall, and not realizing that we're really one organization, and that our whole organization, the collective interest, cannot win without the other side winning also. So no one can change this by themselves. And you know, I kind of said this a little bit earlier, but I think I'm just going to keep repeating it until everyone in the world believes me, that the tool change means a lot less than the rule change. So I see lots of people adopting new tools, you know, going back, whether you're talking about, you know, Puppet, Chef, Ansible, cloud computing, Cloud Foundry, Kubernetes, whatever the tool is, doesn't matter. But then they don't really revisit their process. They don't really revisit their rules. And so in some cases, you have the newest and latest, greatest, you know, continuous delivery pipeline set up, and everyone thinks that's going to change things. But then they didn't work through all of their change management process. They didn't work through, you know, the governance, risk, and compliance. And as a consequence of that, you still have the change management process, all these sign-offs. So you're not going any faster with the containers than you did with the VMs. So going forward, this is just, I'm borrowing this, and this is a brief word of attribution for Jabe, that you have some vocabulary. So you have these two economies, and we'll call them two games. One game on one side is really what we were talking about before, differentiation. The other one is scale. This is the words Jabe uses. Jabe's on my team at Red Hat, and he is a PhD studying how organizations and societies change their behaviors to use new technologies, or to, you know, interact with new technologies. So he sets up this model of two economies, and then in a minute we're going to have three economies. But you have two economies. One is the economy focused on creating value, differentiation. The other one is focused on efficiency, the economy of scale. We've already talked about this. And, you know, this in some ways, like, it could be its own hour-long presentation if you wanted to get into the details, and you know, there's nuance in your organization, I'm sure. But if you're working as a developer, I'm sure you feel these pressures to kind of deliver different value at certain speeds, fast as you can. And then if you're in operations role, I'm sure you feel the kind of the pressure to win this other game about reducing the variation and creating this stability and being able to kind of keep promises and sleep through the night as well. So this is this game that we could go through in detail, but today we'll kind of just say that we can, you know, recognize that these rules exist, and that people's behavior and selfish interests are kind of focused on playing those games in our organizations. So then the question is there a way to connect these games together that allow both sides to win? Both sides can win. And this is, again, this is borrowing Jabe's language from his PhD research. He has, and I'm not sure I love this word, but we'll use it because that's what he used, this idea of a scope economy, which is a third game in the middle. And the scope economy acts like a clutch, which is language from when people drove cars. I don't leave the house anymore, but I used to drive a car. Now I stay at my house anyway. The way that this acts is it's connecting the game of differentiation with the game of scale, so that you can kind of win both by winning this other game in the middle. And that's this thing I'm gonna explain in a minute about the way you get this is through this process of recombining. And I'm also going to give you examples of what I believe are recombining process, and you can kind of think about this. So this is a new game in the middle. How do we get that game? How do we play this game? So it's sort of recognizing that when you set up these two economies with these two games, there's things that are being developed, worked on as innovations that will be more valuable either to the organization or to like a larger context if they were shared, and if they were made more available as part of a, I'll use the word platform in the middle that allows the reuse of that innovation, right? And we see this, and I shared some Wardley map thinking last time, but it's basically this notion of when you have an innovation, it starts with innovation, eventually it's going to become and move towards more of a utility. And that's really what we see with cloud computing in general. But even in our organization, there's things that are being developed, business unit by business unit, developer by developer, that would be more valuable to everyone if they were actually shared. If we weren't reinventing all those things, that if we were kind of working on a shared solution. And then the other side of this is coming from the other direction and recognizing that there are things in our organizations that are probably being managed like they belong in this scale economy, trying to reduce variation, but we're not getting the maximum value from those either, and they would be more valuable to our organization while keeping all the promises about the scale game if they were moved into this platform in the middle as a shared resource. And so the act of recommenting, which I'm going to get a little deeper into in a moment, is about recognizing these different selfish interests and giving up our control of those selfish interests for the collective interests to bring that into the sharing in the middle. And we call this process recommenting, bringing things from the edge into the middle and building this platform. And this is another Carnegie Mellon PhD who currently works at Microsoft, but I think some of his research is so interesting. And he uses the word platforms, but he's not actually talking about technology. In fact, if you read most of his research, what he's talking about is usually groups of people that have nothing to do with technology, managing common shared resources in their kind of shared environment. And that could be anything from tenants in an apartment building to fields and the model. And I'll share a little bit more of his model, because I gave you that advice last time that good DevOps borrow and copy, but the great DevOps steal. So I'm going to steal all this stuff from his dissertation in a second. But basically, his language has nothing to do with tech, nothing to do with DevOps, but I just think it's fascinating that they comes to this language. And his model that I'll share in a minute is really based on the way that villagers in Nigeria have managed shared resources for generations, decades, centuries. And I'll just read this quote. So, platforms may be understood more conceptually as guiding principles that redefine two sides of a binary relationship that will reveal the mass middle as an opportunity for intervention. Platforms can help us recommend resource management through new approaches to negotiation. So the core message there is this notion that there's two sides that have some selfish interest, and that we can, through a process, bring them together in favor of a collective interest through negotiation, through resolving that dilemma by negotiation. So this is straight from Myojis' dissertation. So there's credit at the bottom. I say stolen euphemistically, but I think this is great work, fantastic work, and I'm going to basically kind of reimagine every DevOps conversation that I ever had for the last 10 years through this language, because I like it so much. So let's just look at it, without even thinking about where it come from or why it was invented. The way this language talks about a platform owner, platform partners, platform stakeholders, platform providers. This probably deserves its own presentation for an hour to go through each of these and pick them apart. But you can kind of think about what this would be like in the sense of resolving any sort of shared resource. But then it gives us like this nice set of processes and sort of set of personas and characters, and how they kind of fit together to solve this in general. And then just digging more into, these are some cards that Myojis made about this process and his research for sharing, managing these shared resources. So he has this notion of a town crier, which is, again, call out to the Nigerian, pre-colonial Nigerian process for resolving these things. But this is essentially the person who creates the conditions for everyone to meet together, right? For everyone to get together and have this sort of meeting to resolve these conflicts and resolve these dilemmas. And you can think about this in the large, and you can think about this in the small. In some real sense, and this might be a little bit of a stretch of the imagination, but in some sense, my role in DevOps globally, people like me, Patrick, whatever, we sort of acted like the town crier for this global community to start to come together and sort of work through these different aspects. Each one of these cards is interesting to talk about. I'm not going to go into depth on each of them, but just to kind of call out these roles, and there's more cards than this, but this is just a kind of a representative. So there's this notion of an exploiting commoner, who's someone who is definitely taking advantage of the shared resource, but maybe not always with the most concern for the collective interest. He has what he calls a stewarding commoner, which is someone who is taking advantage of the commons, but also working together to ensure that the commons, those shared resources, are managed in such a way that they will continue to be beneficial to everyone. A scribe, that's important. I am not the best scribe, just so you know. A scribe is someone who keeps all the notes and makes sure that the agreements that we make and sort of the standards and processes and rules that we want to keep are recorded, right? And these are very interesting. There's this notion of an oracle, which is in the model that the Myojis talking about proposing is about the data. So it's like what can we model and predict based on the data? And then this notion of an upstream ally. So someone who is not necessarily directly downstream and sort of using the resources, but someone upstream who can use their power and privilege to help everyone achieve their objectives. And in our framing for most of our organizations, I would consider this kind of like the executive sponsorship for change. So are there good examples? I believe there are. I'm just going to read this for you. I've used this in other contexts, but I'll read it anyway in English. So remove friction from product development, high trust, low process, no handoff between teams, don't do your undifferentiated heavy lifting, use simple patterns automated by tooling, self-service cloud makes impossible things instant. So this is not my words. This is actually from a very old talk from a good friend of mine, Adrian Cockcroft, when he worked at Netflix, giving a talk about Netflix lesson learned. And this in a real sense, if you go listen to the whole talk or see what Netflix did, is the result of them building this process, this kind of recommend platform for themselves to keep these promises to both sides of the equation with respect to differentiation and scale. I'm going to argue that Netflix, Amazon, Google, and every cloud native company built these platforms. They recommend these platforms themselves because they had to. There was no kind of shared tool platform for them to do that. So they build them to serve their mission. I'm going to read this again. This is from the book I gave you homework to read last year. This is the SRE book. If you haven't read the SRE book, I recommend you read it. You can also read the SRE workbook, but this is from the first book. So I'll read it. SRE builds framework modules to implement canonical solutions for the concerned production area. As a result, development teams can focus on the business logic because the framework already takes care of correct infrastructure use. So to me, this is Google describing building their common platform. If you go look at Google and the history of it all evolving, and the purpose and the way it's used, Borg is essentially this scope economy construct that allows Google to keep promises to developers with these kind of self-service access, while also keeping very strong promises based on what I just read to you to the infrastructure. So Borg is a scope economy construct. Kubernetes is also a scope economy construct. Kubernetes is inspired by Borg. It's sort of the open source community version. That is a very interesting project. I think that if you haven't heard of Kubernetes, you probably should go look at it. If you haven't, that's okay too. But also just interesting to think about especially when you think about open source. Kubernetes is an open source global commons to build local platforms commons inside of our organizations. And if you really did the homework I gave you last year and read, I specifically told you should read the chapter on service level objectives from the SRE book. that the act of establishing a service level objective, which is really a three-way contract between the business, the developers, and the operations, the act of doing that and the pattern for what you do when the air budgets are exceeded is really, by definition, in my opinion, a recommeting exercise. So we have these three economic rules, and you win each game by different games or by different kind of outcomes. So differentiation, you win by creating novelty. Scope economy, you win by creating more reuse and sharing. And then the scale economy, you win by creating more efficiency. So the kind of the gold standard, or the, you know, what we all try to get to, in my opinion, is we want developers to be able to have, you know, the ability to create with their you know, creativity and their motivation connected to this platform that keeps these promises by enabling the self-service to the developers, but also preventing, you know, too much problem. And I kind of read the Google version of this, to those reliable compute, networking, storage primitives underneath them. So this is, you know, an evolution of what I like to call the platform as an interface. We can replace the unhappiness with some happiness if we come through this process. And I would say, you know, whether you're talking about Kubernetes or any of the other automation tools, that this is the critical process. It's not about, oh, we're going to deploy this tool and like all of a sudden we're going to have DevOps. It's really about getting those two parties to come together and recognize their collective interests and align on how they're going to work together, and do that with the tool. Not the tool by itself doesn't solve that problem for you, but that's what the real DevOps to me is about, bringing those two sides together to work together. So this problem isn't technical, and the problem isn't people. The problem is social technical. You can't solve it just with tools, and in some sense you can't solve it just with people. You have to solve both of those together. We have to solve both of these together. So people will resist change. So there's a selfish interest, but it's also attached to our identity. And so when you try to tell someone, oh, we're going to change what we're going to do, we're going to change the game you play, then sometimes people will resist that because they feel like they're getting erased. And so you have to kind of overcome this resistance to keep doing things the way we do things, because that's how we do things, by giving people a new story. And you have to help them not only have a new story where they think they're going to be doing something new, but you have to help them become heroes in that new version, in that new game they're going to play. So DevOps is not a project. DevOps is the progressive accumulation of better habits, bringing people together. So making new rules is better than getting new tools, or more important. So what I'm encouraging you to think about is changing your game, changing the game you play, hopefully by resolving the selfish interests in favor of the collective interests. So DevOps is simple, but it's not easy. And I said this last year, these are slides from last year, that the best methodology is inspired people working together. This year I'm going to say it's inspired people coming together to solve their problems. So my quick call to action, and then we'll be done, is work together, change ourselves, change your organization, change our world. Thank you. I'm not here to answer questions, although I will in a second. I'm here to have conversations. Shukran jazilan.